Welcome everyone to this State Government Affairs webinar on bill reading and analysis. We are so excited that you're joining us and that more and more NPs want to be engaged and skilled at understanding state legislation. Just to introduce ourselves, I am Ashley Shue. I'm one of the two state policy analysts at AANP. I cover the states alphabetically, Alabama through Mississippi, and territories, the Marianas Islands and the U.S. Virgin Islands. My policy background and graduate education is in health policy, and before coming to AANP, I worked with other national organizations to address state-specific health policy issues of rural access and women's health.
And I'm Jamie Kings. I primarily work with the latter half of the alphabet, Missouri through Wyoming, as well as territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, and American Samoa. Ashley and I have both been with AANP for 3 years as policy analysts, and since being with AANP, we've worked closely with states and territories that have passed full practice authority, global signature authorization, and dozens of other positive bills that advance quality care, as well as other legislation that has helped stall ugly physician opposition. While states are certainly unique, you'll find that the core principles of good legislative analysis we'll cover today are universal for state legislation. Today, we'd like to share with you a quick snapshot of the process that we use on a daily basis to analyze over 200 bills across all states and territories. We'll be sharing some tips and tricks for screening bills and breaking down legislative jargon to figure out the impact on patients, your practice, and the profession. Today's talk is aimed at helping you determine whether or not to utilize your power as an individual NP and voters to move a piece of legislation forward. So today's objectives are to empower NPs to know where to find laws and rules that govern NP practice, identify common challenges, and articulate impacts in key areas. You may be thinking about your state in particular, but we've geared today toward tools you can use for any state that you may be licensed in or move to. Today, our agenda is to give a quick overview of how state policy is made, the basic parts of a bill in common terms, and then we'll practice analyzing legislation to determine health policy impacts.
Great, so before we get started, we just wanted to do a very quick state policy overview, just kind of what is state policy and what are some mechanisms for change. So there are typically 3 places to look for existing state policy. This is how you would figure out what is the status quo in a state. So the first one that we're mostly talking about today are state laws. We'll also call those statutes or sometimes statutory code. Those are laws that are passed and written by the elected state legislature and signed and enacted usually by the state governor. Today, we're mostly focusing on state laws and the mechanism for changing those laws, which is bills written and passed by the legislature. But we wanted to call some attention to some other items that also shape state policy. When states want to make a change to a state law, a legislator or legislators will introduce a bill during a legislative session, which is that period of time when the state legislature meets to make decisions. And an example of a state law is that all 50 states have enacted a Nurse Practice Act, so that is an existing state law. That's the chapter of state law devoted to governing nursing practice. And typically, any bill or piece of legislation that's going to be important to nurse practitioners will propose making changes to that existing state's Nurse Practice Act. Some of the other policy and change mechanisms in a state also include state rules and regulations. We'll sometimes call that administrative code. Those are things that are written and adopted and changed by a state's executive agencies. That can be like the Department of Health or a Board of Nursing, and they're often at the direction of a new state law. So the regulations or administrative code, that is how state law is interpreted and managed on a daily basis. So a note here is just laws beget regulations. Regulations can never be more flexible than state law. So for example, a question that we encounter on the AANP side is whether the Board of Nursing has the authority to eliminate collaborative or supervisory practice agreements. It is a good question, but the answer is no. So state boards of nursing are only authorized to be as permissive as state law. So if the law mandates collaboration or supervision, the Board of Nursing is not able to just waive that requirement. So additionally, in the majority of states, boards of nursing and other state agencies are prohibited from lobbying or engaging on legislation or taking a position on bills. And that limitation on regulators make it really important for the NP community to analyze legislation first and make sure that bill language accurately matches what the nursing community is looking to achieve. And then third are official forms. Those are also created by state agencies. They're a little bit less formal than state laws or regulations, but what they do is they can codify the sort of in practice of a regulation or law from a state agency. The legislature can also require that an agency make changes, create, or adopt forms. Some examples of that might be vital statistics records or provider orders of life-sustaining treatment.
So now we'll go over some bill basics. What is a bill, the anatomy of a bill, and then some common legislative terms. So first, what is a bill? A bill is a written, filed, formal proposal in the legislature to either change, repeal, or create state laws. A bill is typically called something like House Bill 1867 and has a title that should give you some indication of what it would do or change if it becomes law. In this instance, the title is An Act to Support Access, Value, and Equity in Healthcare, otherwise known as the SAVE Act. So what is a bill not? At the state level, a resolution is a ceremonial expression of that legislature's view, and they are often read on the chamber floor. Resolutions may be celebratory or solemn and often honor an individual or group for service to the state. Resolutions are easily identified by their name and number, such as this one, House Joint Resolution 179, and their title, this one being a resolution recognizing School Nurse Day and during National Nurses Week. For our purposes, resolutions are not going to have an impact on laws governing NP practice. So now that we know what a bill is, let's talk about the parts of a bill. At first, a large piece of legislation may look overwhelming, but there's no need to panic. Here we've broken down the basic elements that you'll want to take note of. So first, we have a bill number. This will tell you two things: the chamber in which it was filed. The most common designations are House Bill and Senate Bill. They are abbreviated HB and SB, but some other designations include Assembly Bill, Legislative Bill, House File, Senate File, and Legislative Docket. Additionally, this number will indicate the order in which the bill was filed. Sometimes the order it is filed is important or symbolic as a way of demonstrating priority for the legislature. Some states will reserve the same bill number during each session for their budget bills. Next, we have the sponsor. This is the legislator who presents the bill for consideration. The sponsor may also be known as the patron or the author. Some states will list all sponsors and co-sponsors on the bill, while others will only list the primary sponsor. In this example, our primary authors are Representative Donato and Representative Khan. The summary, abstract, and title. Summaries and abstracts are just what they sound like, short summaries of the bill's contents. In this example, it is included at the top alongside the sponsor information. In some states, it may be included at the bottom of the preamble or at the end of the bill. Summaries will give you a very quick idea of what the bill is about, but should not be relied upon for an idea of the actual content. These are drafted by legislative staff, and depending on the bill, may be misleading, exaggerated, under-exaggerated, or just not thorough. The title will also give you a quick idea of the bill's purpose, but keep in mind that it may sometimes include some political posturing. For example, this bill would be considered a full practice authority bill for Massachusetts. But in this case, the Massachusetts authors are not calling the bill full practice authority for NPs and are instead leading with the cost-saving benefits by titling it An Act to Support Access, Value, and Equity in Healthcare. SAVE Act. You can expect to see this type of posturing from opposition bills. They won't be titled something like preserving physician authority over nurse practitioner practice, but rather something more innocuous sounding like an act to protect patient safety. In short, don't judge a bill by the title and summary, always read its full contents. Next, we have the enacting clause. This is the section that distinguishes it from a resolution and shows the legislation has the force of law. The example on your screen starts with "be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives in general court assembled." The enacting clause will vary between states, but you can pretty much rely on it to begin with the words "be it enacted." And lastly, the operative text. This is the most important part of the bill, as this is where you will find all of the bill's proposed changes. In this example, you can see right off the bat that it makes amendments to Chapter 94C of the Massachusetts General Laws. Now, some states will draft bills by including the full section of code that is being amended, with the proposed changes included in line with the existing code text. Other states will draft bills with a style similar to that which you see here, where they state inserting after the definition of blank and then the language. To ensure that you understand the bill draft and know exactly what the bill is proposing to change, it's really important to have a copy of your state statute handy when reviewing a bill. Some other tools that you might find useful include the state's legislative drafting guide and their legislative glossary. You can usually find all of these on the state's legislative website.
So other sections of a bill that are important include the preamble, or sometimes called the legislative intent. So this is the part of a bill text that gives a brief explanation of why the legislation is being put forward. It can be a place where the bill sponsor will explain their reasoning, and like the summaries and titles, it can also be a place to look for political posturing. So in this example, the author lays out over the next few pages several really good arguments for reducing barriers to NP care. However, it all follows this handy language that you see highlighted on the screen that says "do not codify." That means that that will not be part of the text that actually changes the state's laws. Not all states have the "do not codify" disclaimer, so the preamble might be something you have to double check for when looking at a bill. But the bottom line for NPs reading and assessing whether to support a bill, don't give too much weight to the title, summary, or preamble. Always check the operative language. And don't get hung up on what's in the introduction here or not there. This will not be the meat and potatoes of the bill. Another important part of a bill is the effective date. An example from a bill here is PASB 25 on the last page. This is from 2019 legislation. An effective date should tell you when an enacted piece of legislation would take effect. Some states have the same effective date for all legislation, and other states will have sort of a stock template that legislative drafters use. When you look for this piece, a thing to look for is whether the effective date is really far away or really soon. For example, most nurse licenses are up for renewal every 2 years, for example. So if an effective date of a bill is going to make a major change to the nurse licensure process, but doesn't align with the 2-year renewal period, that might be something that needs an additional tweak to make the legislation the most effective. You will also want to look for really far away dates. That can sometimes indicate that the effective period of the legislation is still up for negotiation, or that people who maybe oppose the bill are looking to slow walk the effects of an intended piece of legislation. So that is an effective date and some things to look for in that.
Now we're going to go over a few common legislative terms. I'll just read through these, provide a little bit more context. So an act is a piece of legislation that has passed both houses of the legislature. It's been enrolled, ratified, and signed by the governor or passed over the governor's office and printed. It's now a permanent measure and has the force of law until it is repealed. An amendment is an alteration or a proposed alteration to a bill that will add, delete, substitute, or omit language. Amendments can be made at various stages throughout the legislative process. A committee amendment is exactly what it sounds like. It's an amendment to the bill that is offered by the legislative committee. And then a floor amendment is an alteration that is presented by a legislator while that document is being discussed on the floor of that legislator's chamber. Carryover is legislation that has been held over from the first year of a legislative biennium to the second. Note that not all states will have this type of a biennial legislature. Committee substitute is a more substantial committee amendment. So this is a bill that has been offered by a committee in place of another bill that had been referred to the committee for consideration. Some states may term this as a strike below. So next we have crossover deadline. This is the date by which a bill must pass to the other chamber in order to continue being under consideration during a legislative session. Again, not all states have crossover deadlines. Engrossing is generally the process of how adopted amendments and other changes are incorporated into a bill as it makes its way through the legislature. Sine die literally translates to without day. It is the final date of the legislative session. So they are adjourning without a day to come back. Sunset is the date that a provision or a section or a chapter will expire unless it has been reauthorized by the legislature. It may also refer to the program of review of state agencies. Table is when a measure is set aside for possible consideration at a future date. In some states, however, this will mean that the bill has died. So always check your state's glossary. Definitions will vary between states, so don't assume that the definition you're familiar with will hold true for the next definition. So now I'm going to hand it back off to Ashley to walk you through what to keep in mind as you analyze a piece of legislation.
Great. So a couple of things we're going to walk through in analyzing a bill include first reading a bill, how we can compare that to what the current policy is, and then sort of standing back and determining what could be the potential impact of that piece of legislation if enacted. So here are the 4 big questions to help guide analysis of any piece of legislation. First, we want to ask, what appears to be the bill's intent? What are the goals? You can use the preamble, a bill summary, or other legislative resources as a helpful guide. Second, does the bill's new language appear to achieve those goals? Third, we want to ask, but does the bill adequately untangle all other conflicting areas of existing law to achieve its goals? And fourth, finally, how does a bill fit in the larger health policy context? And some big picture elements you can consider include current state policy landscape, how would a bill fit with the consensus model goals for the profession as a whole? What about national models and trends or the NP practice environment message in your state? And of course, how would a bill impact all settings and populations for NP practice? So we're going to walk through an example together. So we are looking at an actual bill. This is 2019 House Bill 2066, which was introduced in Kansas. If you want to pull up this bill yourself, you can see the link at the bottom has the address, and you can pull up the introduced text of the bill. So the first question we're asking of this piece of legislation before us is, what does this bill aim to do? So the first couple of places we'll look, of course, is the title, the summary. We'll pull up any supplementary resources posted along with the bill text. So in this case, I found that in an accompanying plain language fiscal note where the state of Kansas had analyzed the potential budget impacts of this bill, the staff noted HB 2066, as introduced, would no longer require APRNs to establish a collaborative agreement with a responsible physician or have physician oversight of APRN practices. APRNs would be able to prescribe medications independently. So as we're reading and analyzing this bill, I'm going to be looking for examples of where this bill adds new authority for APRNs in Kansas law and where it will repeal those old restrictions. Now that we have an idea of what the bill is trying to do, it's authorize APRNs to prescribe all schedules without barriers. We're going to ask ourselves, does the new bill language add that authority? As you're reading a bill, a tip is to look for text that's emphasized in some way. Every state is going to do this differently, so it's important to use your state's legislative guide to help you determine what you're reading that's existing law and what is new law that's going to be proposed by this bill. In the case of Kansas, I can see that existing law is going to be regular typeface, repealed laws are going to be stricken with a line, and new additions to Kansas statute proposed by the bill are going to be the italicized text. So there are multiple places in this several-page bill where there was new language added to achieve the bill's goal, but I've pulled for us here a particularly good example of the bill laying out its intent. So HB 2066, as introduced, adds the following language to the Kansas Nurse Practice Act. An advanced practice registered nurse may prescribe, procure, and administer prescription drugs and controlled substances in Schedules 2 through 5 pursuant to the applicable federal and state laws. The next part is a really common place that we see stakeholders and even legislators encounter some challenges, and that is answering this question. Does this bill adequately untangle all other existing conflicting or related laws? As you may know, a state's entire code is thousands of pages, it's hundreds of chapters, can have laws dating back as far as the founding of the state. So it is a real challenge to make sure that there are no conflicting language already on the books that would prevent the bill from reaching its goals. And if it is, make sure that the bill captures that and changes it. So in this example, we saw that House Bill 2066 in Kansas made some important and good changes that updated that Nurse Practice Act. But we can also see that those changes depend on some things in two other places, the Pharmacy Act and the Controlled Substances Act. So in the bill text, we saw that as used in this section, the definition of drugs is going to mean those articles and substances defined here in the Kansas statutes annotated 65-1626 or the Pharmacy Act, and 65-4101 or the Kansas Controlled Substances Act and amendments thereto.
So frequently, Ashley and I, when we review bills, we see that the Controlled Substances Act and the Pharmacy Act are the two most commonly missed areas. However, there are many more. So on your screen, you're seeing some of the most common areas of statute that will have laws governing NP practice. Many NPs are aware that the major section is the Nurse Practice Act. And while most bills related to NP practice will make changes to this act, you have to remember to look at these other sections. Each state houses their statutes a little bit differently, and as you become more familiar with your state's code, you will learn which of these chapters you need to worry about and which ones don't. So some states may not have anything in the Pharmacy Practice Act related to nurse practitioners. It may all be in the Controlled Substance Act. Some may split them equally, or vice versa. Some may be in the Pharmacy Practice Act and not as much in the Controlled Substance Act. So you now might be asking, how do I go about assessing a bill against current law, and where do I find those? Luckily, all states have their laws available for free online. If you see a reference to another another law in a bill, more often than not, you can just do a quick Google and it will pop up for you. So from the example Ashley showed us, I saw that the Kansas bill references section 65, 1626. I don't have Kansas law memorized, so I Googled it and I see it listed as regulation of pharmacists in the Pharmacy Act. Clicking on that would take you to the state's website that houses their statutory code, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. This is where you can verify that statute's content. And this can also be accessed from the state's legislative website. Look for a button or a link that says current statutes or current laws. Statute numbers are a little bit like the Dewey Decimal System. They'll tell you exactly where to go to find the language you want, usually indicating the title, and then the article, the chapter, and then the sections. One thing to remember to watch out for is that state laws should always be free to access. If a website doesn't end in .gov or asks for money or a subscription or a login, it's likely not your state's official source.
So now that we have looked up the other sections that we know govern NP practice, we glanced through them for references to nurses and the authorization to practice. In this example, even though the bill text proposed authorizing NPs to prescribe without a physician by making changes in the Nurse Practice Act, when we pulled up the Controlled Substances Act and the Pharmacy Act, we found some conflicting laws. So you can see, for example, the Controlled Substances Act directly ties NPs to a written protocol with a physician to be considered a prescriber of controlled substances. So if the bill had passed without changing the Pharmacy Act and the Controlled Substances Act, patients wouldn't be able to get controlled substance prescriptions that are written by NPs filled at pharmacies without a relationship with a physician. Now, this bill was later amended to align the language found in the Controlled Substance Act and the Pharmacy Act with the intent for the bill to authorize APRNs to prescribe without an agreement. So let's review our bill analysis so far. We asked what the bill aims to do. We determined from the bill and some other resources that Kansas House Bill 2066 aims to authorize NPs to prescribe all agents without barriers. Second, we determined that the new language for the law that was in the bill looks to do a good job of indicating all schedules for APRNs to prescribe without a physician agreement. However, we noticed in the Controlled Substances Act and the Pharmacy Act, sections were not changed by this bill that needed some changes to prevent having conflicting laws on the books. So that is great, 1 through 3, for the sort of nitty-gritty details of lawmaking. But what about stepping back to look at the big picture? Lastly, we always want to ask in a bill analysis, how does this bill fit with the larger context? That includes asking, if this bill were enacted as written, how could House Bill 2066 impact things? For example, we talked about earlier, the state policy landscape, the profession as a whole, and all settings and populations of NP practice. So in determining the impact, today we're mostly talking 101. How do we read and interpret a bill for its content? We're not necessarily talking about how to play the policy game to win. However, part of any analysis is going to be understanding that full impact before determining if you can support or oppose a bill. So NPs need to be able to evaluate and articulate the bill from multiple perspectives. And a good starting place is to always ask, what would this proposal do for the 3 Ps? Those are patients, the profession, and partnerships. For example, as you're reading a bill, you may be thinking of your individual practice setting. So for example, let's say you work in a primary care setting for Kaiser Permanente in a large urban area, a Kaiser Permanente setting which employs NPs and physicians together in the same building. So proposed changes in a bill might seem really doable for your workplace, but we also want to think through, what would that legislation do for all the NPs licensed in the state? How about those that own their own practice or the patients that they treat? How could requirements in a bill impact NPs who work in a different setting, like an acute care hospital setting? And even when you're thinking about your patients, how could it impact those who are maybe referred to your NP colleagues in another setting? We're going to want to think through even things like, what if my patient is visiting family in a rural area and they need immediate care? How could new changes from a bill impact what's actually available to them in that type of environment? So if a bill, for example, uses the term APRN, it's important to think through how could that apply to all the other roles. That is our section there on partners. So sometimes to fully evaluate a bill, it's really important to talk these things out with other healthcare colleagues, NP colleagues, and hear from your patients and look to other stakeholder partners and fully understand what that legislation could mean in the big picture. So returning to our bill analysis completed, if we ask that question of this bill, we could imagine with the amendment to the sections that we found of the conflicting laws in the prescribing statutes, this bill, House Bill 2066, wants to authorize NPs in Kansas to prescribe without barriers. And it could, for patients, create opportunities for patients to get treatment from even more qualified providers. For the profession, it could add Kansas to the list of modernized states that had implemented this type of best practice. And for our partners, it could help employers by attracting and retaining a new NP workforce. So that's how we might approach that question for this bill.
So now that we've walked through the main elements of analyzing legislation, there are, of course, lots of details that can help NPs throughout the process. These items can help orient you before you really dig into an analysis. Bill sponsor can be a helpful context clue. What do you know about this legislator? Is he or she a traditional friendly legislator, or are they traditionally an opponent? This can help you as you're reading to look for false concessions from an opponent. Bill status, where is it in the process? If the bill is just at introduction or before formal filing and it's just a draft, that can help you as you're reading as well. For example, some drafts might not have select dates filled in. If a bill is on the very last stage before final passage, it may have gone through numerous or significant changes, and you can know to keep an eye out for any conflicting language while you're reading. Always be sure that you're analyzing the most recent version of the legislation. Deadlines. This is really important to prioritize. We spoke a little bit earlier about the crossover deadline. There may also be a committee deadline. So the date by which a committee has to pass that bill for it to go to the floor. Your time is valuable, and you don't want to accidentally spend your time analyzing a 90-page bill that is past the date for consideration in a session. Also, if a bill is right up against a make it or break it deadline, there can be last-minute amendments made to try to please all stakeholders and move that bill through the process. Time pressure can make for hasty drafting mistakes or messy compromises, so always keep an eye on your deadlines. Companion legislation. Sometimes the bill may be introduced in both the House and the Senate. This can provide an added opportunity to move bills through the process more quickly. If you are reviewing a House bill that has a Senate companion and that companion has taken on heavy amendments, you can then be reasonably sure that if the House bill was to make it over to the Senate, those same changes would likely occur. We might consider companion amendments as a sort of barometer. If a bill in one chamber takes on a lot of amendments, it's a high indicator that similar amendments will be required for it to pass both chambers. If those are contentious, sometimes they will have to go to what is called a conference committee at the end of the legislative session to hash out the differences. In our experience, it's much easier to see amendments get added on than to get removed or pulled off later in the process. Legislative reference guide. We mentioned this earlier as well. This gets into the weeds of bill analysis a little bit, but it's really important as states draft bills differently. Most states will have a guide on the legislative website that will help you understand how to read the bill draft. It will let you know how amendments and deletions are stylized within the bill. So as Ashley mentioned with Kansas, they use bold and italicized. There may also be underlined, strike through, brackets, asterisks. If it isn't obvious when you're reading through the bill, go look for the legislative reference guide and it will all be explained in there. For all of this, you need to know what the current law says to understand what the bill proposes to do differently. Like we've mentioned frequently, it's a very good idea to have that state code next to you and review it as you're going through the bill. So here is our step-by-step process for reading a bill and some small things to watch out for. We recommend reading through a piece of legislation once, just fully, and then going back through and making notes. As you're taking notes, you want to keep an eye out for terms like and, or, may, shall, must, notwithstanding, whereas. We've seen legislation where these words may be drafting errors or they're included by intent. And the difference between may and shall has huge implications. So if a bill says a nurse practitioner may consult with pharmacists as necessary for patient care, it means that they are able to consult with them when they feel it is necessary. Whereas if it says a nurse practitioner shall consult, then they have to consult with them every single time. Next, it's really important to understand the bill in context. You want to always compare it to current law and look up your reference sections. And lastly, review amendments sequentially in the order in which they have been filed. And be sure to check whether those amendments are to the bill, are to the existing law, or to a previous amendment. Now, here are some concerning landmines and opposition group compromises that we've seen cropping up with more and more frequency over the last few years. These are some questions you want to think about as you review or draft legislation. If you answer yes to any of these questions, then you need to analyze the bill further. A yes is a red flag that could signal the bill has had undue opposition influence. These elements would limit nurse practitioner practice, potentially move your state further away from bringing better access to NP care in more places. Over the last several state legislative sessions, we've seen physician opposition efforts attempt to overly weight NP bills with longer periods under collaboration or supervisor, or more onerous requirements for NPs in select settings, particularly in nurse practitioner-owned businesses or nurse practitioner-led practices. One common thread was for opposition groups to require transition periods to resemble those of physician residency programs, and included excessive timelines, on-site physician collaboration and supervision, a formal structured education during these periods, and new forms of attestation to competency beyond completing one of the NP certifying exams. We're also seeing opposition working to co-opt the conversation about rural access into a conversation about creating rural-only exemptions from collaboration requirements for those NPs who work in state-designated provider shortage areas. There are more opposition pushback areas, and these are always changing, but these questions are a really good place to start to help you spot red flags and indicate a bill that you might not want to support.
Right, so along those lines, today we've been mostly talking about how to read and understand a piece of legislation to determine NP engagement, but we did want to share, in addition to the political context, some other common challenges that will factor into NP analysis. The first that we see is the misuse of terms. So we often see bad bills that would further restrict NP practice. They're filed with the influence of opposition groups and titled or use the term full practice authority to mean something other than the true definition. For example, you might see a bad bill that's titled full practice authority for NPs that would only authorize NPs in the state's hospitals, for example, to practice select services without a physician contract. So this is often a concerted effort on the part of opposition to redefine what full practice authority means to fit scenarios that better benefit their interests rather than actually create full and direct access to NP care. Another thing to watch out for is that often legislators or their staff can be less well versed in nursing titling, education, and terminology. So it's important to ensure when reading a bill that APRN, for example, really is intended to apply to all 4 roles, or that a more general term like nurses is actually intended to apply to advanced practice as well as the rest of the nursing workforce.
And from technical issues and drafting areas, legislation needs proofreading too. Sometimes there are honest mistakes, but sometimes errors can have huge consequences. You want to watch out for placeholder language or devices, or even an instance of failure to have the bill amend the most recent update of the state's code of laws. Politically, we also encounter legislation that doesn't create a net gain. For example, one state NP group was engaged with legislation that would have retired an outdated restriction on NP ordering of tests, but in the process, it would create a 5-year residency-like requirement for all APRNs just to provide that one service. The NP group wisely stepped away from this, knowing it was not a compromise that gained patients new access, and it actually created a new barrier that would make it more complicated for NPs and patients to get needed services in the future. Lastly, we see that state lawmakers and stakeholders miss carve-outs in law that conflict with legislative goals. So, for example, a bill may retire physician practice agreements intending to ensure direct access to all NP services, but it fails to strike a section of law that prohibits NPs from prescribing stimulants to pediatric patients. These are just a few. We're always available to help our partners spot and prepare for these and other common legislative and political sticky points. A few more helpful hints. We've touched on this earlier, but here's some other ways to check your understanding of a bill and its impact. You want to look for supplemental resources like the bill summaries and the fiscal notes. So fiscal notes, the goal of a fiscal note is to state in dollars the estimated cost of enacting a piece of legislation. Quite frequently, they will include a summary of the bill's contents, and they're generally completed by the agency that is responsible for rulemaking. Occasionally, fiscal notes can be used as a strategy to kill a bill or set it up for an amendment. As state budgets are generally tight and compete for multiple priorities, bills with high fiscal costs generally are less likely to be successful. Summaries, if not included in the bill itself, may be completed by the staff of a committee to which the bill has been assigned or by the Legislative Research Office. As we stated earlier, these can be a good starting point for a confusing or a large bill, but always verify the information. How detailed a summary is will vary by state, and quite often one will never even be completed, especially if it is for a small bill. And lastly, always compare notes. Please feel free to reach out to AANP for assistance or check our bill tracker, where we provide summaries and updates on important pieces of NP legislation.
Yes, so here is our team and our team email where you can reach us. We really hope that you've learned more today about how to read and understand legislation and state laws and determine the impacts for patients in the profession. We look forward to engaging you again for more policy topics in the near future. Goodbye.